Jaya Kunja Bihari Gopijana Vallabha Jaya Girivaradari Jaya Girivaradari Gopijana Vallabha Jaya Girivaradari Jaya Girivaradari Yashoda Nandana Jaya Raja Janaranjana Yashoda Nandana Jaya Raja Janaranjana Jamuna Tiravanachari Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Kunja Bihari Jamuna Tiravanachari Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Jaya Kunja Bihari Gopijana Vallabha Jaya Girivaradari Jaya Girivaradari Gopijana Vallabha Jaya Girivaradari Jaya Girivaradari Yashoda Nandana Jaya Raja Janaranjana Jaya Jaya Yashoda Nandana Jaya Raja Janaranjana Jamuna Tiravanachari Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Kunja Bihari Jamuna Tiravanachari Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Jaya Kunja Shri Radha Madhava ki jai, Shri Radha Damodara ki jai. Jai Om Vishnu Pada Paramhamsa Vivajakacharya Tarasata Shri Srimad Divine Grace Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada ki jai. Jai Om Vishnu Pada Paramhamsa Vivajakacharya Tarasata Shri Srimad Divine Grace Srila Bhakti Radhita Goswami Maharaj Prabhupada ki jai. Garantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Itago Premanandi Haribo. Jai Radhamadava really puts everything into perspective, doesn't it? What are we doing in this world? Should just sing Jai Radhamadava all the time. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Today we're reading from the Srimad Bhagavatam in its 5th canto, chapter 5, text 21 and 22. Bhuteshu virubhya udutamaye sirisripasteshu sabodhanishtaha tato manushya pramatastatopi gandharva siddha vibudhanugaye devasarebhyo bhagavat pradana dakshadayo brahma sutas tutesham pavaparaso tavirincha virya samat paroham dvija deva deva Bhuteshu virubhya udutamaye sarisripasteshu sabodhanishtaha tato manushya pramatastatopi gandharva siddha vibudhanugaye devasarebhyo bhagavat pradana dakshadayo brahma sutas tutesham pavaparaso tavirincha virya samat paroham dvija deva deva Bhuteshu virubhya udutamaye sarisripasteshu sabodhanishta tato manushya pramatastatopi gandharva siddha vibudhanugaye devasarebhyo bhagavat pradana dakshadayo brahma sutastutesham pavaparaso tavarincha viryaha samat paroham dvija deva deva. Word for word translation says, Bhuteshu, among things generated with and without symptoms of life, virubhyaha, then the planets, udutamaha, far superior, yea, those who, sarisripaha, moving entities like worms and snakes. Teshu, of them, sabodhanishta, those who have developed intelligence. Tata, then them, Manushaha, the human beings, Pramataha, the ghostly spirits, Tata api, better than them, Gandharva, the inhabitants of Gandharva Loka, appointed singers in the planets of the demigods, Siddha, the inhabitants of Siddha Loka, who have all mystic powers, Vibhuda Anugaha, the Kinnaras, yea, those who, Deva, the demigods, Asurebhya, then the Asuras, Bhagavat Pradanaha, headed by Indra, Daksha Adayaha, beginning with Daksha, Brahmasutaha, the direct sons of Brahma. 2, then, Tesham, of them, Bhavaha, Lord Shiva. Para, the best, Sa, he, Lord Shiva, Ata, moreover, Virincha Viryaha, producing from Lord Brahma. Sa, he, Brahma, Matparaha, my devotee, Aham, I, Dvija Deva Devaha, a worshipper of the Brahmanas, or the Lord of the Brahmanas. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace. Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Translation, this is Lord Rishabhdev continuing to instruct his sons. Of the two energies manifest, spirit and dull matter, beings possessing living force, vegetables, grass, trees, and plants, are superior to dull matter, stone, earth, etc. Superior to non-moving plants and vegetables are worms and snakes, which can move. Superior to worms and snakes are animals that have developed intelligence. Superior to animals are human beings, and superior to human beings are ghosts because they have no material bodies. Wow. Hare Krishna. Superior to ghosts are the Gandharvas. This kind of illustrates just how problematic is the body. We shouldn't take this as like, well, I should just become a ghost then. But we should see that having a material body, the more dense the matter of your material body, the more problematic it is. Superior to ghosts are the Gandharvas, and superior to them are the Siddhas. Superior to the Siddhas are the Kinnaras, and superior to them are the Asuras. Superior to the Asuras are the demigods, and of the demigods, Indra, the king of heaven, is supreme. Superior to Indra are the direct sons of Lord Brahma, sons like King Daksha. And supreme among Brahma's sons is Lord Shiva. Yes, he's the son of Brahma. Lord Shiva is the son of Lord Brahma. Brahma is considered superior, but Brahma is also subordinate to me, the supreme personality of Godhead, because I am inclined to the Brahmanas. The Brahmanas are best of all. Hare Krishna. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. In this verse, the Brahmanas are given a position superior to that of the Supreme Lord. The idea is that the government should be conducted under the guidance of the Brahmanas. Although Rishabdev recommended his eldest son, Bharat, as emperor of the earth, he still had to follow the instructions of the Brahmanas in order to govern the world perfectly. The Lord is worshipped as Brahmanya Deva. We all know that verse. Right? Namo Brahmanya Devaya Go Brahmana Hitaya Cha Jagaritaya Krishnaya Govindaya Namo Namah. That verse glorifies Krishna, Govinda, as the Brahmanya Deva, who's worshipped by the Brahmanas and very fond of the Brahmanas. The Lord is worshipped as Brahmanya Deva. The Lord is very fond of devotees or Brahmanas. This does not refer to so-called caste Brahmanas, but to qualified Brahmanas. A Brahmana should be qualified with the 8 qualities mentioned in text 24, such as Shama, Dhamma, Satya, and Titiksha. The Brahmanas should always be worshipped, and under their guidance, the ruler should discharge his duty and rule the citizens. Unfortunately, in this age of Kali, the executive is not selected by very intelligent people, nor is he guided by qualified Brahmanas. Consequently, chaos results. The mass of people should be educated in Krishna consciousness so that according to the democratic process, they can select a first-class devotee like Bharat Maharaj to head the government. Here's Prabhupada endorsing democracy. If the head of the state is headed by qualified Brahmanas, everything is completely perfect. In this verse, Prabhupada's purport continuing on. It's a bit long. If you want to read along, please check it out. 5th canto, 5th chapter, text 21 and 22. In this verse, the evolutionary process is indirectly mentioned. The modern theory that life evolves from matter is to some extent supported in this verse because it is stated, Bhuteshu virubdhyaha. That is, living entities evolve from vegetables, grass, plants, and trees, which are superior to dull matter. In other words, matter has the potency to manifest living entities in the form of vegetables. In this sense, life comes out of matter, but matter also comes out of life. As Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, Aham sarvasya prabhavo mata sarvam pravartate. I am the source of all spiritual and material worlds. Everything emanates from me. There are 2 energies, material and spiritual, and both originally come from Krishna. Doesn't he say in the Bhagavad Gita, Sadasat Cham Arjuna? He says, for me, they're both Sat and Asat. They're both me. Krishna is the supreme living being, although it may be said that in the material world, a living force is generated. It must be admitted that originally matter is generated from the supreme living being. Nityo Nityanam, Chaitanas Chaitananam. The conclusion is that everything, both material and spiritual, is generated from the Supreme Being. From the evolutionary point of view, perfection is reached when the living entity attains the platform of a Brahmana. A Brahmana is a worshipper of the Supreme Brahman, and the Supreme Brahman worships the Brahmana. In other words, the devotee is subordinate to the Supreme Lord, and the Lord is inclined to see to the satisfaction of his devotee. A Brahmana is called Dvijadeva, and the Lord is called Dvijadeva Deva. He is the Lord of the Brahmanas. The evolutionary process is explained in Chaitanya Charitamrita, in the Madhya Lila, chapter 19. And it is said that there are two types of living entities, moving and non-moving. Among moving entities, there are birds, beasts, aquatics, human beings, and so on. Of these, the human beings are supposed to be the best, but they are few. Of these small numbers of human beings, there are many low-class human beings, lechas, pulindas, podas, and shabaras. The human being elevated enough to accept the Vedic principles is superior. Among those who accept the Vedic principles, generally known as Varnashrama, presently known as the Hindu system, few actually follow these principles. Of those who actually follow the Vedic principles, most perform fruitive activity or pious activity or elevation to a high position. Manusyanam sahasreshu kaschid yatati siddhaya. Out of many attached to fruitive activity, one may be a jnani, that is, one philosophically inclined and superior to the karmis. Yatatam apisiddhanam kaschinmam vetti tattvataha. Out of many jnanis, one may be liberated from material bondage, and out of many millions of liberated jnanis, one may become a devotee of Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Om Jnanatimirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurum Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Svayam Rupa Karamayam Dadati Swaparantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Parakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Scham Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Paran Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitam Shcham He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Rishabhanu Sutta Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaura Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So, what an incredible purport from His Divine Grace. Srila Prabhupada is always giving us important things to think about, to contemplate, to apply our intelligence to understanding, because otherwise, we are lower on this hierarchy. Prabhupada is encouraging us, let's move up, moving on up. Because in this list described in verse 21 and 22, humans are closer to the bottom than they are to the top. I'm just going to point that out there. It was dull matter, plants, worms and snakes, animals with intelligence, and then humans. And then there was like another 10 items and people superior to humans. So it should be a little humbling, but to recognize that the human life is the junction between gross materialistic animal life and the potential for spiritual progress. So it's a very important junction. We want to make sure that we pull out the map. The map is the Srimad Bhagavatam, and make sure we're going in the right direction. Because others, there are many human beings who do not have developed intelligence. What did Prabhupada say here? And that therefore are not going anywhere. It says out of the very small numbers of human beings, there are many low-class human beings, and they're not doing anything very interesting besides eating, sleeping, mating, and defending their property like a royal edition of the animals. Now, we shouldn't judge. We should try to uplift those persons. We should try to encourage them. Tato Brahma Jigyasa. You have superior technology in the human body. You should use that for inquiry into the absolute truth. I was just reading the introduction of Bhagavad Gita with Justin yesterday, 2 days ago. And we're reading the statement in the introduction where Prabhupada says, every endeavor of the human being is to be considered a failure if he does not inquire about the absolute truth. And Justin was just like, wow, how can Prabhupada say something like that? Just totally shocked. But that's the truth. Every endeavor of the human being is to be considered a failure if he does not inquire into the absolute truth. So we should encourage people to come to that level, not just say, well, I'm better than the Mlechas and the Pulindas and the Podas and the Shabaras. What a boring life to just like think about how you're better than everybody. What a really sad life, actually. Ugh. I'm better by default. No, our mission is to uplift people to the human status by encouraging them to inquire about the absolute truth. And more specifically, if they are inclined and very fortunate, to inquire about Krishna. And that's evolution. That's the real evolution. That's how someone progresses, is by contact with knowledge of Krishna, devotees of Krishna. Someone progresses through this hierarchy of beings. The animals, they progress by the force of nature very, very slowly. If by some misfortune you are born as a cucumber, right? Maladits agorets, as they say. If you're born as a cucumber, you have to wait to go through every different species of cucumber. And then, you might be upgraded to spaghetti squash, because nobody likes spaghetti squash. And you have to go through every different species of spaghetti squash until you can finally make it to, a superior vegetable like the butternut squash, the king of vegetables. And then you have to go through every different type of squash and then every type of potato. And then it takes a long time to, by force of evolution, as Prabhupada's saying here, for that jiva to finally come into a human body. It's like a river flowing. It's pushing the jiva into superior species of life, from vegetable to moving creatures like worms and snakes. For those that don't have feet are considered inferior to those who do have feet. There's other part in Bhagavatam which describes even more intricate hierarchy between the feet-having animals and the two-footed animals and the four-footed animals and all this sort of stuff. But it takes a long time by force of nature for the jiva to pass through all these different bodies and finally come to human form, which is the junction for genuine spiritual life. Like spaghetti squash. Get out of here. It's like a bowl of worms. So, what a good fortune. It takes a long time, but this is the evolution that Prabhupada endorses. What does he say here? In this verse, the evolutionary process is indirectly mentioned. We're pushed through different species of life. This one, after this one, after this one, until you finally come to the human form. And then we can inquire about the nature of the absolute truth. Inquire, what is God? Everybody's talking about him. Should have to know. What is the origin of everything? What is the source? That's what the intelligent person asks. And then we know that evolution is really working. Otherwise, the so-called evolution of Darwin is extremely problematic. And I might indulge myself, and I hope that listeners today would find it interesting, indulge in some critique, because Srila Prabhupada did actually say, the more you stomp on Darwin's head, the more you worship Radha and Krishna. So these boots are made for walking, and that's just what they'll do. Because there's a lot of problems with the theory, and it's so problematic because, as this verse is describing, we move forward. We're meant to move forward materially, so that into higher and higher forms of life, because then one can more effectively understand the absolute truth, understand Krishna. But the modern Darwinian theory of evolution does the exact opposite. It's like, here you are, you're going through all these different species of life, from vegetable to worm to snake to, I don't know, slug to some sort of mouse, some marsupial. You finally, after such a long time of going through all these different species of life, you come to the human form of life, and then the Darwinists come along and say, you are just a primate, just surrender to your monkey brain and just mate and go right back down. Any sort of aspiration towards metaphysical concepts is just a hallucination within your crude monkey brain. Really, your only purpose is to pass on your genetic material. So just give up all of that God stuff and eat, drink, and be merry. Of course, they're not so merry, especially with the modern criticism of the theory. So this evolutionary theory of Darwin is just so problematic. It is so antithetical to spiritual progress. And it's just a convoluted justification for sense gratification. And so Prabhupada was right. We should stomp on Darwin's head. Not literally, although you can go to Westminster Abbey and find his grave. I'm not suggesting that. He tried his best. But we should be very critical of theory. And there's so many good reasons to be, because it's got more holes than spaghetti squash. It's looser. It's got less foundation than spaghetti squash. So here's my favorite, my top 20 criticisms of Darwin's theory of evolution. This is just my personal curated list. There are plenty of others. These are just the ones that I've had problems with, and I've shared this list with people time and time again, and have rarely gotten anything of a response. I'm just going to go through briefly. I shared it in the chat if you all want to have a look in the Zoom chat here. And we should be very critical of its claims, because it is so, as I said, it is so antithetical to what we are doing in Krishna consciousness. We don't need to go out and make enemies, like some religious zealots, but we should recognize that there is an ideological enemy in this Darwinian evolution, and it is the state-mandated religion. We do have to recognize that the way science works these days is there's something called scientism, whereby people view scientific ideas as a sort of religion, and they have the same sort of faith and devotion to it. And it is mandated by the state, that everyone in public education, the public school system, must learn this state-mandated religion. It is ultimately a metaphysical belief system about, who we are and what we're supposed to be doing. So it is a state-mandated religion, and it is our ideological enemy. It is the exact opposite of what we're trying to accomplish with Lord Chaitanya Sankirtan. So therefore, we should take a little time and dissect it and criticize it. So if you're interested, here's my top 20 problems. I put 10 prominent empirical problems with the theory and 10 prominent philosophical problems. I'll just go through really quickly. I'd love to hear back from those of you who are also experienced in this stuff. So one of the main ones, which is interestingly worked upon right here at Penn State, is horizontal gene transfer, where they found that that genes can be passed on not just hereditarily through the father and mother to their offspring, the next generation, but also horizontally. There are some entities that can actually consume other beings and absorb the genetic material and be mutated by that. And we're not just talking about some funny bacteria or something, some fungus or some mold, but right here in the state, there was a researcher studying carnivorous plants. You think of the Venus flytrap, and there's some other carnivorous plants whose genetics become changed by the insects that they consumed. So the horizontal gene transfer discovery totally upsets this conceptual tree of life that we were all taught as kids. That there's some first living entity, some organism, and then it mutates into this sort of tree, whereby one organism is like the origin of so many other organisms that are evolving from it. But if there is horizontal gene transfer, it's no longer a tree. It now becomes like a web. Completely upsets that whole idea of the tree of life that we were constantly taught about. And it makes it near impossible to determine what would be the last universal common ancestor, often called Luca, in those fields. People want to know what is the last universal common ancestor, but horizontal gene transfer makes that nearly impossible. So the second empirical problem is that the lack of a viable mechanism for producing the complex and specific information required to render the genetic code functional. You can look up that guy named Stephen Meyer, who talks about this a lot, how he says that genetic material is both complex and specific. It needs to be complex and specific for the genetic code to be functional. An example is that something is complex if it's, if I took 108 random characters from my keyboard and mashed them, that's very complex, but it's not specific. Something is specific if there's a noticeable pattern which lends to its information content. Like if I just did A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, that's specific. Be both complex and specific for it to actually be functional. So I can't just mash letters and numbers and characters on my keyboard. I put them together in a very specific order for it to actually convey information that's functional. So he's saying the same is there for the genetic code. And as of yet, there is no viable mechanism for producing complex and specific information except for and the main proponents of, what is it called? Intelligent design. So that's kind of this whole thing, that the only reasonable explanation for that complex and specific information is an intelligent source, which of course is a dog whistle for God, but I don't like it in science. The fossil record is a big issue. That's the third one. Of course, we all know Jutta Karma Prabhu's work in that field. Number 4, rampant examples of convergent evolution indicate extreme probability. Convergent are very interesting, whereby in very different places of the world, we find very similar so-called evolutionary traits, where different creatures start to become more similar. It's called convergent evolution. Improbable, but whatever. The people who support these theories were never been one to shy away from extreme improbability. Somehow they just kind of let that go. Abiogenesis means first life, as Prabhupada has often said, as we've heard him say a million times. Just create one living cell. If you could just create one living cell, then we might have some evidence that life comes from matter. But as of yet, no one is able to do that. So that's called abiogenesis. How did the first living matter come about? Biogeographical distribution irregularities. Again, this refers to how in different places of the world, we see that there's not like a linear pattern to how different organisms would evolve. Rather, in different places, there's similar organisms apparently evolving on opposite parts of the world, which again is just so irregular and definitely challenges the theory. Stop me if this is boring. I mean, I thought it was kind of interesting. I think we should know some of these problems when you talk to people about it. Number 7, this is really interesting. There's something called junk DNA or endogenous retroviruses, which is sort of like a remnant of some DNA kind of left in one's DNA code. And the famous Richard Dawkins at one point said that this was the greatest evidence for evolution. He said that this is one of like the best things, that there's no other explanation for this ERV, endogenous retroviruses and junk DNA, until, you know, a few years later, someone pointed out that the sheer volume of junk DNA, the DNA that's kind of like passed on from one organism to its next of kin, but doesn't really have any function, that sheer volume is just so huge that it can no longer be considered any sort of evidence that we came from this origin. You know, his whole thing was that because there's similar ERVs, endogenous retroviruses, in humans as there are in some types of apes, that therefore that's the evidence that we came from apes. But of course, more modern research has shown that there's such a huge volume of junk DNA and ERV that it really can't be pointing towards any particular origin. So what used to be Dawkins' #1 evidence is now. Dawkins has been very quiet lately. I don't know what he's doing anymore, but he had his heyday. I guess the result of his loud barking, because he did claim to be Darwin's bulldog, the result of his barking is that some people barked back, and I guess he's kind of shut up now. He's busy counting all of his money from his books. Anyway. What did I put here? Number 8, epigenetics cannot be reduced to a mechanism, certainly not natural selection. Epigenetics is when the claim is made that something is causing the genetic material to change, but it's not hereditary. It could be different environmental functions. Actually, I have to look that up again. I can't remember what that is. Plasticity is really interesting. Plasticity is the modern discovery from a group, because there's so many problems with the theory. There's a new scientific group out now. They're trying to produce neo-Darwinism, trying to make neo-Darwinism the new thing. They're like, okay, the old Darwinism that you learned in public school obviously had a lot of problems. So there's a lot of people working on what's called neo-Darwinism, where they're trying to like deal with those problems. And one of the things that they've discovered, and they've admitted as one of the biggest problems, is this term of plasticity, where the genotypes and the phenotypes are not a direct correlation. A genotype means there's some code in the genetics, you know, A, B, G, C, whatever. And it usually that relates to a particular phenotype. A phenotype is, you know, the skin color or whatever, what is the type of hair that's growing. The phenotype is what is the physical feature of that organism. And they've discovered that there's a plasticity, they call it. Sometimes one particular genetic code produces this phenotype so that the color of the hair is brown. And then in other times, that same genotype, that very same genetic code might produce a different phenotype, and that hair will come out in a different color. So they're saying there's no longer a direct correlation between the genotypes and the phenotypes, which of course just throws a huge spanner in the works. And the last of the empirical evidences, which is very interesting, there's a lot of interesting experiments done about this, is that beneficial mutations are impossibly rare. The whole idea of this Darwinian evolution is that there's this, as the cells are dividing and that genetic material is copied, sometimes there's a mutation, and that mutation might produce something beneficial for that organism to survive. And that because that organism survives better, it will be passed on, that mutation will be passed on to the next of kin, blah, 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 blah. But in the laboratory, we observe that beneficial mutations are impossibly rare, meaning the overwhelming majority of mutations that happen are destructive and degenerative. There's been tons of experiments done about that. I mentioned a few here. Richard Lenski did one with bacteria. A woman, Molly Burke, did one with fruit flies, where they just blast these fruit flies with radiation or different types of catalysts for the mutation, because fruit flies, they reproduce very quickly and they're relatively more advanced compared to bacteria and plants and stuff. They found that all the different ways that you can make them mutate and reproduce, in almost all cases, the mutations that happened were degenerative and caused the death of these organisms. Very rarely do we see a mutation as being beneficial. I mean, of course, we see that in human society also. When human children are born with some mutation, it's almost always degenerative. Sometimes that degenerative mutation could be perceived as being beneficial if you're only looking like from a particular perspective. An analogy is given that if you have a car that's driving along the highway and you're trying to go from State College all the way to Dallas or something really far, and it takes a lot of energy to do that, you could have a degenerative mutation to that car, like say, well, let me just take out the back seat. If you take out the back seat and reduce the weight of the car, it'll go a little further. And you go even farther and say, well, I don't even need bumpers, so let me just take off the bumpers. It's just heavy metal. You could just keep breaking it down, and you might get the impression that, well, it's working even better now. But actually, it's degenerating. It's falling apart. All observations of mutations in laboratories are degenerative. They're not beneficial. So there could be an argument made that actually we're devolving. And that's kind of the perspective of the Vedas, by the way. We're getting smaller. We're definitely becoming less intelligent. Svalpa alpa medasa. So according to Bhagavatam, this is true. We are generating. Anyway, those are my 10 empirical problems. I've got 10 philosophical ones. I'm just going to go through really quickly because I don't want to bore everybody. But there's this guy, Alvin Plantinga, who made this evolutionary argument against naturalism. And his point is that if, by definition, our human intelligence has evolved from the mud, it has evolved only for the purpose of survival and reproduction. It has not evolved for the purpose of intelligence and understanding the truth. And so therefore, we cannot trust our own brain to understand and make the theory of evolution. That's his philosophical problem. If we've evolved from the mud, then it would only be for survival and reproduction, not for intelligence, not for understanding the truth. So how could we know the truth of evolution theory? He illustrates that the combination of naturalism and evolution is self-defeating because under these assumptions, the probability that humans have evolved reliable cognitive faculties is low or inscrutable. This has prompted many ambitious thinkers to suggest that consciousness is an illusion. There's a guy in England, no, I'm sorry, in Germany. What was his name? Metzer. And he's really trying to push this theory. You don't actually have consciousness. It's just an illusion. You only have your evolutionary brain. And in order to kind of like keep you going in this necessary cycle of reproduction, the brain just kind of like gives you this feeling, like a hallucination that you exist as a person. The whole Matrix thing. Obviously, he was watching the Matrix too much and taking a lot of drugs, because he also has some department for researching psychedelics and the effect on the mind. But this is how science works. He gets a good idea, he gets some notoriety, he makes a little progress and some headway, and then people all over the world have to read his papers. They don't have a choice. So be forewarned. This is going to be the new theory. This is coming to a conversation near you. Well, we're not really conscious. It's just an hallucination. It's coming. Be prepared. Number 2 here, humans show many behavioral and cognitive traits and abilities that offer no apparent survival advantage. Art, music, religion, introspection, homosexuality. Very interesting. If you ever want to hear some serious clasping at straws, there's this great video of this prominent scientist. He's trying to answer questions about evolution, get people excited about it. And someone asked him a question, well, why is there homosexuality? And just the way he's like reaching around trying to make it work is just really desperate and pathetic. There are a lot of cognitive and behavioral traits of humans, especially, that offer no apparent survival advantage. And so it kind of flies in the face of Darwin's idea that we're only evolving for survival and for reproduction. Why do we spend so much time making art and music? Some they say, well, it's just for sex. I stopped some guy on the street once on book distribution in Sydney, and he's like, yeah, we just evolved from the mud and it's all just about sex. I was trying to give him a book. And then he was like arguing with me for some time. We were in some shopping area, and then his girlfriend came up. His girlfriend like caught up with him. And I turned to him and I said, could you just repeat everything that you told me to your girlfriend? And he just got like so red and embarrassed, because you can't just say that to your girlfriend. Of course, she's thinking, no, there's love and there's care and there's affection and we're doing so many special things together. You know, she's a young girl, like, our relationship is so special. But he's just like, no, it's all just about practical sexual attraction. There's nothing else, just trying to reproduce and move on. So I said, you please tell that to your girlfriend. He got very embarrassed and walked away. A few more, and I swear I'll stop talking. Evolution has become a necessary secular creation myth, and it's ejected from the realm of objective science because it's now highly politicized. This is one of my philosophical problems. It's very difficult to think objectively and rationally about the theory because it has become so politicized. It is a necessary secular creation myth. Everyone needs a creation story. And for the secularists, they need one too. And this is a necessary one. And so it's very difficult to be objective about these sort of things. We see that, of course, with religious people too. It's very difficult for them to be objective about their beliefs. And because the theory has become a necessary creation myth, it's very hard for people to be objective about it. So there's still research done, you know, there's still scientific conferences and discussions and whatnot, but the objectivity is waning because it is so highly politicized. When something is so politicized, people have very strong feelings about it and they can't be as objective. And so therefore it's not very scientific. The qualification for being scientific is objectivity, neutrality, observation, but it's becoming harder and harder every day. Determinism, as implied by evolution, is dangerously irrational and hypocritical. You know, if whatever I'm thinking or doing is just the result of my genetic material and whatever I ate for breakfast, then all of our legal court systems are just out. You know, the way justice works depends upon the fundamental belief that there is free will, that you do choose to act in a particular way. If there were no such thing, we would not have justice. We would not have any court system. None of that would be functional. And so evolutionary theory does imply determinism, and that's dangerously irrational and hypocritical and just does not work in a human society. So it looks nice on paper, but nobody lives like that. So how valuable is the theory if it's just, you can't actually act upon that? Here's an interesting one. Democracy is founded on the metaphysical claim which contradicts the tenets of evolution. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Of course, Jefferson and who wrote that? Mostly Jefferson, I think, was referring to equal on the spiritual level. We're not equal materially, obviously. Everyone's got very different things going on, but we're equal on a spiritual level, endowed by their creator with inalienable rights such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, imagine some sort of political system based on the theory of evolution. Can you imagine? Like now we have democracy. It's problematic, but certainly better than whatever political, social structure would be explicitly based on the theory of evolution, where only the sexy are in charge. Whoever is the most attractive, or whoever is like physically the strongest would be the leader. It would be an absolute mess. So again, the theory in our human society. Really quickly, the last one's quantum uncertainty undermines the mechanistic nature of evolutionary theory. That's the whole thing. I'm not going to open that can of worms right now. Evolution cannot be rationally explained without recourse to vitalist rhetoric. Dawkins is famous for writing this book, The Selfish Gene. It's like when we speak about how these things work, you have to use vitalist rhetoric. That means talking about them as if they were conscious entities. That's what vitalist rhetoric means. We have to describe the genes as being selfish, as if it's a conscious thing. Oftentimes, even in physics, right? I don't know if Klaus Rupp is in here, but he can testify that when they speak about the way matter works, you have to use vitalist rhetoric to say that it wants to be in this, it wants to do this thing, or it has this desire. You can't rationally explain the theories without vitalist rhetoric. And of course, that implies, from our perspective, it implies a supreme consciousness which permeates these things, a paramatma. That's our explanation. But they can't say that. They just use the vitalist rhetoric without referring to the vital thing itself, the supersoul. Almost done. All too frequently, critique of evolutionary theory is dismissed by appealing to vox populi. Vox populi, of course, means popular vote. This is a logical fallacy, but they say, well, you have to accept evolution because all the scientists do. No, not all the scientists do. There's a lot of disagreement and debate, but people will push it on you like you have to because it's the most popular theory. But that doesn't mean that it's true. That's a logical fallacy. Esotericism, the claim that a certified expert is qualified to critique the theory, but every layman is obliged to accept the theory. This is something that you'll see if you look at the forums and debates on these sort of things. You'll often hear people say, well, you can't critique it because you haven't gotten a doctorate degree in biology or microbiology or something, so you're not allowed to critique it. So you can't understand it because you're not an expert, but you are obliged to accept it. So that's called esotericism. Obviously, that's not very intelligent. And the last one that I put here is that any evolution experiment cannot be performed except by design. And that's kind of the whole point of the intelligent design group. Although I don't agree with everything that they're doing, but their main thing is like, it's so obviously designed, you can't even do an experiment about evolution except by design. So how are you going to somehow prove that it's not designed? Philosophically, it's just so problematic. There we go. I hope you found some of that interesting. I do think that if you are talking with people, trying to impress upon them the need for Krishna consciousness, you will either directly or indirectly come across opposition based on what has been taught as Darwin's theory of evolution. And we have to be prepared to point out a lot of the fallacy with that and be amazed and surprised at how people are just like, wow, I don't really have to accept this. I mean, I see it all the time. We do it at the Bhakti Yoga Center all the time. I share these lists and I very arrogantly and confidently disagree with a theory and argue it. And, people have never heard that before because it's like the state-sponsored religion and because it's like untouchable. You're not allowed to critique it in a lot of circles in the school system, that therefore they're really surprised when someone confidently, points out a lot of these flaws. And it can really change a person's mind. We have to recognize that it's very influential ideology and it is absolutely antithetical to Krishna consciousness. And therefore we should be prepared to put it in its place, stomp on Darwin's head, figuratively stomp on Darwin's head. So that's a little something about evolution. In this verse, Lord Rishabhdev is pointing out that the actual evolution happens by the force of material nature. A living entity is pushed through different forms of life until they finally come to the human form, which is a junction whereby they can go up or down. And that we should recognize that there's a lot more going on beyond human life. There are many other superior forms, but ultimately the most superior are the Brahmanas who are most dear to the Lord. And that's a subject for another day. Hare Krishna. Thanks for listening to me. I hope it didn't bore everyone. I hope you got something out of this you find relevant or interesting. Any thoughts or comments or retorts or challenges? Hoping Kala Swarup would say something. What do you think, Kala Swarup?
Yes.
Can you?
Very nice class.
Thank you, Prabhu.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts, but I'll just say a couple to be brief. You mentioned the idea that that some people have that consciousness is an illusion,
Yeah.
and that it'll be coming to a conversation near us at some point in the future.
Mm-hmm.
But I actually have had conversations where people have claimed that.
Yeah.
It's a very prominent idea for a while now, actually, in philosophy of mind, where, for example, one of the main theories or philosophies is called attention schema theory, where basically the idea is that we have this model of our attention, and that by imperfect knowledge of this model, somehow we are illusioned that consciousness occurs. So these ideas, they start out in one small branch of philosophy or science, and then they make the rounds to all the other ones. So what the philosophers of mind have been saying for a little bit now, I guess, has rotated over to evolutionists. But that's very easily refuted, and that to be illusioned, there has to be something to be illusioned. As you can't be illusioned if you aren't conscious in the first place.
Mm-hmm. The rock is not an illusion.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's a self-defeating argument, because you have to be conscious to be illusioned, but then consciousness can't be an illusion. And the second comment that I guess I'll make is on the point of mutations, because it's something that I've been thinking about on and off for a little bit, is that you correctly pointed out that the rate of beneficial mutations is extremely low. And I've had the idea that even if you take beneficial mutations, they generally only help you in one aspect. So let's say there's a mutation that lets somebody run 15% faster, let's say, so that they can outrun tigers faster. But that doesn't help them in not dying by drowning or getting their head clubbed in by their neighbor. So the actual rate of beneficial mutations that are passed on is even lower than the rate of beneficial mutations, which is already extremely low.
Mm-hmm. Yes, one of the biggest problems, challenges to evolution theory is just math. In fact, there was another Penn State researcher who published a paper on that in the 90s. I think we talked about it before. He's just talking about like the mathematical impossibility, like the probabilities here, the numbers are just too large for us to conceive. The chance is like 1 out of 10 to the 9 billionth power. He actually did the math to try to find out statistically how some of these things could work. So yeah, very problematic, but that's not going to stop it from being very easily accepted and mandated as the state religion. Science works on the principle that in the future, we'll figure it all out. Prabhupada this, right? But yeah. These problems are there now, but in the future, we'll definitely solve all of this, and we'll make it very clear that it is entirely possible. So for now, you have to accept it.
And like you said, there's the aspect of you'd be able to understand it if you could understand the math. As in, you'd agree with it if you were mathematically literate as the scientists. Because a lot of modern science, I won't say all, but a lot of modern science is cloaked in the aura of mathematics, meaning that the scientists, if you're disagreeing with them and you're a lay person, could always say, oh, it's very complicated and you have to take so many mathematics classes in order to even argue against it.
Right.
Of course, most people, by the time they take all of those classes, are indoctrinated enough to agree.
Yeah. Indoctrinated or threatened, because if you agree,
Yes.
you don't get the degree and you lose your
Yeah.
job. Well, as His Holiness Srilananda Goswami would say, yeah, the scientists can make an argument. Well, you have to take advanced level math classes. Well, I think these scientists need to take philosophy classes. He said, how many scientists are required to take some classes on epistemology, philosophy?
Yeah. No, nobody or very few people really care about the philosophy side,
Of course.
at least in physics. The attitude is mostly just shut up and calculate.
Mm-hmm. Yes. That's not to say that there aren't some very good scientists doing incredible work out there, of course, but we do have to be able to see through the smoke and mirrors and the snake oil and recognize, as I said in one of the parts of my list, that because some theories have become like a necessary creation myth, people cannot be objective about it. And they're going to hold on to it even in the face of overwhelming contrary evidence. Just how a lot of people are. It's how a lot of religious people are too. And the same phenomenon happens within certain scientific theories. It's of overwhelming contrary evidence. People are just going to hold on adamantly. And evolution is that main one. Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing. I looked up, by the way, the guy is Thomas Metzinger, who's the one who's really trying to tell everybody that you don't even have a conscience while also taking heaps of acid. You don't see that in the papers, but he's got it, like his side project is take lots of acid.
Yeah, the many worlds so-called interpretation of quantum mechanics was also birthed by an acid trip. So,
Hare Krishna.
Thank you again for your class, Prabhu.
Thank you for commenting. I'm glad you had some thoughts. Hare Krishna. So I guess we should finish there, a little over time. Don't see the Lords yet. Are they there? No. They're there. We're just not there. If we close our eyes and go within, we can see Radha Damodar all the time, but we can't see them on Zoom yet. So unless there's any other comments or challenges, I'll just say thank you for listening, and do ask that we do take some of this seriously, because people are learning it. Whether we like it or not, everyone is learning evolutionary theory, and it is kind of a problem. Hare Krishna. All glories to Srila Prabhupada, who so confidently spoke out against it. I mean, imagine just such confidence. He's absolutely right. And all of his criticism, he's absolutely right. He may not have been an expert, but his criticism has always been correct. So we're so indebted to Srila Prabhupada for that. Hare Krishna. Krantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Nitai Gaur Premanandi, Hari Hari Bol.